The day Linus Okafor nearly poisoned a conference of the 12 most powerful species in the galaxy began, like most catastrophes, with excessive optimism. Standing in the gleaming galley of the mercantile claw, surrounded by cooking implements that resembled medieval torture devices more than kitchen utensils, he took a deep breath of superheated air and smiled. The massive ventilation hood above him whooshed loudly, drawing away plumes of oddly colored steam from a series of bubbling cauldrons. Each contained a different protein base for tonight's main course, Breath of the Fire Mountain, a Draconis delicacy so complex it required specialized respiratory equipment for non-Draconis chefs. "Temperature check on primary fusion reactor," Linus called to his assistant, a lanky Previan whose feathered arms were currently elbow-deep in a mixture that resembled molten gold. "Holding at 14,000 kelvins. Chef." The Previan, named Tick, replied cheerfully. "The psionic compounds are stabilizing nicely." Linus nodded, adjusting the temperature dial on his forearm-mounted control panel. The specialized chef's jacket he wore had been custom-designed for cooking Draconis cuisine, with built-in cooling systems, thermal dampeners, and emergency countermeasures in case any of the more volatile ingredients decided to achieve sentience, which happened more often than the official Draconis cookbooks admitted. 6 months ago. He would have laughed if someone had told him he'd be here. 6 months ago. He'd been a kitchen assistant at Callaway's Interstellar Diner, attached to the forgettable Outpost Station 9B on the Western Spiral Arm, a way station so unremarkable that most ships' navigators had to be reminded it existed at all. But that was before the Draconis Shipping Consortium had arrived, before everything changed, and before Linus discovered that his peculiar talent for flavor combinations would catapult him from obscurity to, well, whatever this was, fame, diplomatic relevance, a position with a significantly higher mortality rate. "Chef, the Galactic Trade Federation delegates are beginning to arrive," announced Zorax, the imposing Draconis culinary attaché who had become Linus's unlikely mentor. The enormous, scaled being ducked slightly to enter the kitchen, his massive head nearly brushing the 12-foot ceiling. "The first secretary of the Lithosian Harmony has specifically requested your presence at the introduction ceremony." Linus wiped his hands on his apron. "All 7 ritual courses are prepped and synchronized. We're just waiting on the final stabilization of the Fire Mountain." Zorax's multifaceted eyes glinted with what Linus had come to recognize as approval. "Excellent. Remember, this dinner is not merely about sustenance. The Galactic Trade Federation is considering exclusive shipping rights through Draconis territories. And the way to a dragon's heart is through their 4 stomachs." Linus finished with a grin. "Precisely." Zorax's massive tail twitched, a gesture that would have sent most humans diving for cover 6 months ago, but which Linus now recognized as the Draconis equivalent of an amused chuckle. "Though I still find it peculiar that your species condenses such wisdom into pithy sayings." "It's a human thing," Linus replied, checking his cooking timeline once more. "Speaking of which, is it time for my traditional pre-service panic attack? Or should I wait until the appetizers are served?" Zorax made a rumbling sound in his enormous chest. "Save your anxiety for the dessert course. Chef Okafor. That is when the Hegemony representatives will be evaluating your performance most critically." With that ominous reminder, Zorax ducked back out of the kitchen, leaving Linus to wonder, not for the first time, how exactly he had ended up here. Cooking for dragons and diplomats when just 6 months ago, he'd been scrubbing grease traps and dreaming of someday running his own food cart. The answer, of course, began with laughter. Not his own, but directed at him, the very thing that had ignited his determination to prove everyone wrong. Outpost Station 9B had never been a destination. It was a place ships stopped when they needed emergency repairs, when crew needed mandatory rest periods, or when captains were desperate to offload cargo that was beginning to smell suspicious. Attached to the station's central hub was Callaway's Interstellar Diner, a greasy spoon that served food of such mediocre quality that most species agreed it was technically edible, which was the best one could hope for in this quadrant. Linus had been working at Callaway's for 11 months, having dropped out of his third year at the Terran Culinary Institute when his scholarship funding evaporated after Earth's economic restructuring. 21 years old, with a passion for flavor combinations and a knack for improvisation. He'd taken the job at Callaway's as a temporary measure. Nearly a year later, he was still there, chopping synthetic vegetable analogs and dreaming of the day he'd have his own kitchen. "Order up. Table 7 wants the Proxima pasta, extra mild," called Thurman, the assistant manager and self-appointed lord of the kitchen domain. He was a thin, perpetually sweating man who had been at Callaway's for 15 years and wore his seniority like a crown. Linus nodded, reaching for a packet of dehydrated pasta substrate. "On it. And try not to overseason it this time," Thurman added with a sneer. "The Centaurians complained that your last batch had excessive flavor profiles. They're repeat customers, unlike your experimental dishes." Linus bit his tongue. His experimental dishes were merely attempts to make the bland, mass-produced food slightly more palatable. Unfortunately, his natural inclination toward bold flavors didn't align with Callaway's commitment to cuisine so inoffensive it bordered on tastelessness. The day had proceeded like any other until the massive Draconis shipping vessel, the Mercantile Claw, had docked at Station 9B. The arrival of a Draconis ship was rare enough to cause a stir, but when 3 actual Draconis representatives entered Callaway's, the entire diner fell silent. Draconis were imposing by any standard, 12 feet tall at minimum, with scaled bodies that shimmered with iridescent patterns, eyes that gleamed with ancient intelligence, and a reputation for being as particular about their food as they were ruthless in business negotiations. They were biological dragons, essentially, though they preferred the term evolved saurian sentience. Director Katri, the station administrator, had rushed to greet them personally. Linus, curious, had peered out from the kitchen to watch the exchange. "Welcome to Outpost Station 9B, Director Katri said, attempting to hide her nervousness. "We're honored by your presence. How may we assist the esteemed Draconis Shipping Consortium today?" The largest of the 3 Draconis, scales gleaming a deep crimson that shifted to gold along his spine, surveyed the diner with obvious disdain. "I am Zorax, cultural attaché to the consortium," he rumbled, his voice so deep that the glassware on nearby tables vibrated. "These are my colleagues, Vexra and Kra. Our vessel requires maintenance that your station has agreed to provide. We were informed that sustenance could be obtained at this establishment while we wait." Director Katri beamed. "Absolutely. Callaway's serves a variety of dishes designed to accommodate all known digestive systems. Please, take any table, and we will require the private dining area," interrupted Vexra, the slightly smaller Draconis with midnight blue scales. "Our species prefers not to consume nutrition in full view of others." Of course. Katri nodded frantically, gesturing toward the station's only private dining room, a space normally reserved for diplomatic functions or the occasional spacer wedding reception. The 3 Draconis folded themselves somewhat awkwardly into the room, their tails carefully tucked to avoid knocking over furniture. Katri personally handed them menus, then scurried back to the kitchen. "Thurman," she hissed urgently, "the Draconis Shipping Consortium is here. If we impress them, they might consider adding us to their regular route. Do you know what that would mean for this station?" Thurman nodded, suddenly looking as nervous as Katri. "I'll prepare our premium selections personally." "See that you do," Katri replied. "The Draconis controls shipping throughout 3 sectors. This could put us on the map." An hour later, the hopeful atmosphere had dissolved into panic. The Draconis had rejected every dish presented to them, declaring each one an insult to the concept of nutrition and evidence that your species lacks functioning taste receptors. Zorax, clearly the leader, had finally emerged from the private dining room. His multifaceted eyes narrowed in disgust. "Director," he addressed Katri, who had been hovering anxiously nearby. "Your establishment has committed what our culture considers a culinary crime. The substances you call food lack complexity, depth, and the essential thermal flavor transitions required for basic palatability." Katri blanched. I'm terribly sorry. Attaché Zorax. Perhaps we could offer you something else. A different preparation method, perhaps." Zorax made a dismissive gesture with one clawed hand. "The issue is fundamental. We had heard rumors that human cooking was simplistic, but we did not expect such blandness." He turned to his companions. "The consortium will be forced to exclude Station 9B from our consideration for regular shipping routes. We cannot patronize an establishment that serves such offensive fare." The implications were immediately clear to everyone. Without inclusion in the Draconis shipping routes, Station 9B would continue to barely scrape by, serving only emergency stops and budget transporters. "Please," Katri pleaded, "there must be something we can offer that would meet your standards." Zorax paused, considering. "There is one possibility. A challenge of sorts. If your establishment can produce a single meal that satisfies Draconis culinary standards, we will reconsider our position." "Absolutely," Katri agreed instantly. "Our chef would be delighted to—" "Impossible," Thurman interrupted, his face pale. "I mean no disrespect, but Draconis cuisine requires specialized equipment, ingredients we don't have, not to mention the thermal requirements." "So you refuse the challenge?" Vexra asked, her tone suggesting this was exactly what she had expected. "No," Katri exclaimed. "We accept. Of course we accept. Thurman will." "I cannot produce Draconis cuisine," Thurman admitted, looking both terrified and embarrassed. "The techniques are beyond my training." A heavy silence fell over the diner. Linus, who had been watching the exchange from the kitchen doorway, felt a strange tension building in his chest. Before he could reconsider, he stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said, his voice sounding much steadier than he felt. Every head turned toward him, human and Draconis alike. Thurman snorted. "You? The assistant who can't even make Proxima pasta without excessive flavor profiles?" "That's why I can do this," Linus replied, gathering courage with each word. "I understand flavor complexity. I've studied xenogastronomy. I can adapt." Laughter erupted from the kitchen staff. Nervous, disbelieving laughter that stung Linus's pride but somehow strengthened his resolve. "The boy can barely boil water without supervision." Thurman said to Katri, "This is absurd." Zorax, however, was studying Linus with unexpected interest. "You believe you can prepare food that would satisfy Draconis standards?" he asked, skepticism evident in his rumbling voice. "I believe I can try," Linus answered honestly. "And I understand what's at stake for the station." Director Katri looked desperately between Thurman's dismissive expression and Linus's determined one. "What would this challenge entail, exactly?" she asked Zorax. "The human would accompany us to our vessel." Zorax explained. "He would be given access to proper facilities and 3 attempts to create a dish that meets our standards. If he succeeds, Station 9B joins our regular route. If he fails—" Zorax's multiple rows of teeth gleamed in what might have been a smile. "Well, we simply continue on our way, and nothing changes for your little outpost." Katri bit her lip, clearly calculating the risk versus reward. Finally, she nodded. "We accept your terms. Linus will represent Callaway's and Station 9B in this challenge." As the words left her mouth, Linus felt a wave of terror wash over him. What had he just volunteered for? Thurman's mocking laughter followed him as Zorax gestured for Linus to gather his things. "Oh, this is perfect." Thurman chortled. Our future depends on the dropout who thinks Centaurians need spicy food. Linus squared his shoulders and met Zorax's gaze. When do we start? Immediately. The Draconis replied. Pack nothing. All you require will be provided aboard the Mercantile Claw. As Linus followed the three massive beings toward the docking bay, he heard the continued laughter of his colleagues fading behind him. He had no idea what he was walking into. But one thing was certain, he was finally getting out of Calloway's, even if it might be the last professional decision he ever made. Ta! The Mercantile Claw was unlike any vessel Linus had ever seen, even in the interactive education modules at the Culinary Institute. From the outside, it resembled a massive, elongated arrowhead, its surface gleaming with a material that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Inside, it was a marvel of design that blended biological elements with advanced technology. Corridors pulsed with soft, ambient light that seemed to flow rather than simply illuminate. And the air carried complex scents that Linus's human olfactory system could only partially process. This way, Zorax directed, leading Linus through a series of chambers that grew progressively warmer. Our culinary facilities are maintained at temperatures that approximate our homeworld's equatorial regions. Linus nodded, already beginning to sweat. And how hot is that, exactly? A mere 60 degrees Celsius, Vexra supplied. Quite mild, actually. Linus tried not to show his alarm. That was 140 degrees Fahrenheit, well above the temperature at which human proteins began to denature. In other words, hot enough to cook him. I may need some sort of environmental support, he admitted. Krah. The smallest of the three Draconis, who had remained silent until now, made a sound that might have been a laugh. The human acknowledges his limitations. Perhaps he is not entirely foolish. Environmental assistance can be arranged, Zorax confirmed, though it will, of course, add to the challenge of creating authentic Draconis cuisine. They arrived at a massive circular chamber that Linus immediately recognized as a kitchen, albeit one designed for beings much larger and more heat-resistant than humans. Gleaming surfaces of unknown metallic alloys stretched in all directions, supporting equipment that ranged from recognizable, something like a stove, only much larger, to completely alien, a pulsating crystalline structure that emitted both light and what appeared to be sound waves. This is our secondary nutrition preparation chamber, Zorax explained. It has been temporarily adjusted to accommodate your fragility. Indeed. Linus noticed that one section of the kitchen had been modified with what looked like human-scaled equipment, though still made of the same exotic materials as the rest of the facilities. The challenge begins now, Vexra announced, gesturing to what appeared to be a storage unit embedded in the wall. These are standard Draconis ingredients. You will have access to basic information about their properties through this terminal. She indicated a screen mounted at human height. You have 3 attempts to create a dish that meets our standards. Zorax reiterated. Your first attempt will begin immediately and must be completed within 2 standard hours. With that, the 3 Draconis moved to a raised platform at one end of the chamber, arranging themselves behind a curved counter that gave them a perfect view of Linus's workspace. Linus took a deep breath and approached the ingredient storage unit. As it slid open, he was confronted with an array of substances that bore little resemblance to anything he recognized as food. Luminescent liquids in various hues, crystalline structures that seemed to shift and move on their own, powders that sparkled with potential energy, and objects that might have been vegetables, though they pulsed with an inner light that suggested they were still, in some sense, alive. He turned to the terminal and began to scan information about the available ingredients, trying to make sense of the complex biochemistry displayed on the screen. According to the data, Draconis digestion required extreme temperature variations, not just hot food, but food that underwent precise thermal transitions during consumption. The concept of twice burning in particular, seemed central to their cuisine. Dishes that produced an initial heat sensation followed by a secondary, more intense thermal reaction after being partially digested. "Your time begins now," Kra announced, activating what appeared to be a countdown display that projected into the air above Linus's workspace. With shaking hands but growing determination, Linus selected several ingredients that the terminal indicated would produce complementary flavor profiles, including a violet liquid described as essence of volcanic memory and crystalline structures labeled thermal amplification nodes. For his first attempt, he decided to create something analogous to a soup, a relatively simple preparation method that would allow him to focus on understanding the fundamental flavor preferences of his Draconis judges. Following the terminal's guidance, he combined the ingredients in what he hoped were appropriate proportions, using equipment that responded to touch in unexpected ways. The cooking surface adjusted its temperature based on the specific ingredients placed upon it, and utensils seemed to adapt their physical properties to optimize interaction with whatever they touched. After 90 minutes of increasingly frantic experimentation, Linus presented his first creation, a luminescent purple broth containing suspended crystalline elements that shifted and chimed against each other when the bowl was moved. "I call this Echo of Distant Flames," he announced, trying to hide his uncertainty behind a confident presentation. The three Draconis leaned forward, their elongated snouts hovering above the dish as they inhaled its aroma. Without using utensils, Zorax was the first to taste the creation, his forked tongue extending to sample the liquid. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Zorax's scales flared outward, his eyes widened to their full circumference, and he emitted a sound that Linus could only describe as a cross between a steam whistle and a startled elephant. A moment later, a jet of bright blue flame erupted from Zorax's nostrils, shooting nearly to the ceiling before dissipating. Vexra and Kra quickly backed away as Zorax continued to make the alarming noise, now accompanied by violent coughing that sent smaller jets of flame in various directions. Is he okay?" Linus asked, horrified. "I didn't mean to." "You have achieved the scream of the void," Kra observed, sounding almost impressed. "Few non-Draconis have ever managed to induce such a reaction." "Is that good?" Linus ventured. "It is memorable," Vexra replied diplomatically as Zorax finally regained his composure, "but not, I'm afraid, what we would consider culinary success." Zorax, his scales now lying flat again, fixed Linus with a gaze that contained both irritation and a hint of respect. "Your first attempt has failed," he declared, his voice raspier than before. "However, you have demonstrated an unexpected grasp of thermal flavor principles, albeit applied with excessive enthusiasm. So I made it too spicy," Linus translated. "You created what we would classify as a weapon," Kra corrected. "Though an interesting one." Linus nodded, mentally recalibrating his approach as he returned to the workspace. For his second attempt, he would need to be more subtle, focusing on balance rather than intensity. The second try went somewhat better. Drawing on his training at the Culinary Institute, Linus approached the Draconis ingredients with greater respect for their potency, creating a dish that resembled a savory custard with layers of different thermal profiles. When presented to the judges, this creation produced no pyrotechnics, but neither did it impress. Zorax described it as aggressively mediocre, while Vexra suggested it had all the excitement of interstellar vacuum. Kra simply pushed it aside after a single taste. With his final attempt looming and no closer to understanding what would satisfy his judges, Linus felt desperation setting in. He had one last chance to create something that would save Station 9B's economic future and his own professional dignity. As he stared at the array of alien ingredients, a memory surfaced from his childhood. His grandmother, preparing a traditional Nigerian dish, explaining how certain foods carry the essence of home, of belonging. The secret, she had told him, is not just in the ingredients, but in understanding what the eater truly hungers for. What did Draconis truly hunger for? According to the terminal data, their homeworld was a place of extreme environmental contrasts, volcanic regions along crystalline formations, acid lakes bordering forests of metallic vegetation. Their evolutionary history suggested predatory origins, yet their current biology showed adaptations for omnivorous consumption. With sudden clarity, Linus realized his mistake. He had been trying to create dishes that showcased the ingredients, when he should have been creating an experience that resonated with Draconis' sensory memory. For his final attempt, Linus selected ingredients that the terminal indicated originated from different regions of the Draconis homeworld. The centerpiece was a protein structure that still pulsed with bioelectric energy, essentially the heart of some creature, still technically alive even though removed from its body. Around this, he created a landscape of textures and temperatures, crystals that would melt at precisely body temperature, essence extracts that would activate different sensory receptors in sequence, and minerals that would create miniature pressure differentials during consumption. As he worked, Linus noticed the three judges watching him with increased attention, their posture shifting from bored disappointment to cautious interest. When the final countdown reached 0, Linus presented his creation with nervous pride. "This is seared remembrance of home," he announced. The dish resembled a small, self-contained ecosystem more than food. The still-beating heart at its center was surrounded by concentric rings of different substances, some glowing, others refracting light in hypnotic patterns. Steam rose from certain sections while others remained encased in delicate crystalline structures. For a long moment, the three Draconis simply stared at the dish. Then, with a ceremony that hadn't been present in the previous tastings, they each extended a foreclaw and selected elements from different sections, combining them with precise movements before consuming them. Linus held his breath, waiting for the verdict. When no immediate reaction came, he feared he had failed again, perhaps producing something so bland it didn't merit even criticism. Then, Zorax spoke, his voice unusually soft. "You have created something unexpected. Is that good?" Linus asked hesitantly. "It is remarkable," Vexra answered, her multifaceted eyes fixed on the remaining portions of the dish. "You have somehow captured the essence of the molten plains at dawn. The thermal transitions are precise," Kra added, sounding almost reluctant to offer praise. "The flavor memory activation sequence follows traditional patterns." Zorax leaned forward, studying Linus with newfound intensity. "How did you know to arrange the crystalline structures in the formation of ancestral respect? This is not information available in the basic terminal data." Linus blinked, surprised. I just thought it looked balanced that way. The colors seemed to complement each other, and the thermal readings suggested they would create an interesting progression of sensations. The three Draconis exchanged glances, communicating something Linus couldn't interpret. "You have passed the challenge," Zorax finally declared. "Station 9B will be added to our regular shipping route." Relief flooded through Linus, along with a surge of pride that he hadn't felt since his early days at the Culinary Institute. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I'm honored that you found my dish acceptable." "It was considerably more than acceptable," Vexra corrected, "which presents us with an unexpected opportunity." "Opportunity?" Linus echoed. Zorax nodded, his massive head moving with deliberate gravity. "The Mercantile Claw has been without a dedicated culinary specialist for some time. Our previous chef accepted a position with the Galactic Diplomatic Corps." Linus stared, not quite comprehending what was being suggested. "We are offering you employment," Kra clarified, seeming annoyed at having to be so direct. "As the Mercantile Claw's chef, with specific responsibility for Draconis nutritional requirements." "You want me to be your Personal chef? Linus asked, stunned. Chef is the closest human translation, Zorax confirmed. Though in our culture, the position encompasses aspects of nutritional science, cultural preservation, and artistic expression. But I don't know anything about Draconis cuisine, Linus protested. I just got lucky with one dish. Vexra made a dismissive gesture. You demonstrated an intuitive understanding of our sensory preferences without prior training. That is rarer than technical knowledge, which can be acquired and more valuable, Kra added. Linus's mind raced. This was an opportunity beyond anything he could have imagined, a chance to learn an entirely new culinary tradition, to travel beyond the limited confines of Outpost Station 9B, to actually use his creativity instead of suppressing it. What about my position at Callaway's? He asked, though he already knew he didn't care about the answer. Your contract will be purchased from your current employer, Zorax explained. Assuming you accept our offer. Linus thought of Thurman's dismissive laughter, of the years he might spend working his way up from assistant to actual cook at a diner that prided itself on blandness. Then he thought of the dish he had just created, something truly original, something that had connected with beings from another world. I accept, he said, extending his hand before remembering that Draconis didn't shake hands. He awkwardly lowered it again. Zorax's scales rippled in what Linus would later learn was the Draconis expression of formal approval. Then it is settled. You will begin immediately. Your first task will be to establish a proper culinary workspace suited to your physiological limitations while still capable of producing authentic Draconis cuisine. And just like that, Linus Okafor, dropout, kitchen assistant, human, became the chef to 3 of the most discerning eaters in the galaxy. The 6 months that followed were the most challenging, exhausting, and exhilarating of Linus's life. Creating a workable kitchen environment aboard the Mercantile Claw required extensive modifications, including cooling systems that would allow Linus to function in the high temperatures preferred by his employers without diluting the authentic thermal profiles of Draconis cuisine. The solution ultimately came in the form of a specialized chef's jacket, a marvel of engineering that regulated his body temperature while allowing him to work directly with superheated ingredients. The garment, created by the ship's technical division, became Linus's most prized possession, a symbol of his unique position bridging 2 vastly different culinary worlds. Learning Draconis cuisine proved even more challenging than adapting to the physical environment. The conceptual framework was entirely different from human cooking traditions, where humans organize dishes by course, appetizer, main dessert. Draconis meals were structured around sensory progressions designed to activate specific neurological pathways in sequence. The technique of twice burning was particularly difficult to master. Creating dishes that would undergo a precisely timed secondary thermal reaction after being partially digested required an understanding of biochemistry far beyond what Linus had studied at the Culinary Institute. He spent hours each day studying Draconis digestive processes, metabolic pathways, and sensory receptor configurations. Zorax proved to be a demanding but surprisingly patient teacher. Each evening, after the ship's main activities had concluded, he would join Linus in the kitchen to evaluate the day's experiments and offer insights into Draconis culinary tradition. You continue to approach flavor from a human perspective, Zorax observed one night, after tasting Linus's latest attempt at a traditional Draconis ceremonial dish. You think of taste as separate from temperature, when for us, they are aspects of the same sensory experience. Linus nodded, making notes on his tablet. It's difficult to conceptualize. Humans experience temperature as a physical sensation distinct from flavor. Try this, Zorax suggested, selecting a small crystalline structure from a nearby container. Place it on your specialized tasting platform. The specialized tasting platform was a device the technical division had created to allow Linus to safely sample Draconis ingredients. It analyzed the chemical composition of foods and created a modified version that wouldn't kill him while still conveying the essential flavor profile. Linus placed the crystal on the platform, watching as it was scanned and processed. A small, human-safe sample emerged, which he cautiously tasted. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced before. The crystal seemed to create a cascade of temperature changes on his tongue, from cool to warm to intensely hot, each phase carrying different flavor notes that harmonized into a complex whole. "That's amazing," he breathed. "It's like tasting a story." Zorax's scales rippled with approval. "Now you begin to understand. For Draconis, a meal is a narrative told through sensory experience. The tradition of the sacred feast, in particular, is our culture's most important storytelling method." "The sacred feast?" Linus asked, eager to learn more. "A ceremonial meal consisting of 7 sensory progressions, each representing one of the ancestral migrations that shaped our species," Zorax explained. "It is traditionally served only during the most significant diplomatic negotiations or celebrations." Over the following months, Linus immersed himself in the study of Draconis culinary traditions, particularly the sacred feast. He learned that the ritual meal was more than a demonstration of cooking skill. It was a cultural affirmation, a way of maintaining connection to the Draconis evolutionary past while engaging with their present role as interstellar merchants and diplomats. As his understanding deepened, so did his relationship with his Draconis employers. What had begun as a strictly professional arrangement gradually evolved into something resembling mutual respect. Vexra, in particular, seemed intrigued by Linus's human perspective on flavor and began requesting dishes that combined Draconis thermal flavor principles with Earth-inspired ingredient combinations. Even Kra, initially the most skeptical of Linus's abilities, eventually acknowledged his progress. "Your thermal control has improved," he noted after a particularly successful dinner service. The progression from volcanic memory to crystalline resolution was adequate. Coming from Kra, this was effusive praise. The true test of Linus's growing mastery came 4 months into his employment, when the mercantile claw was scheduled to host representatives from the Lithosian Harmony, a reclusive species known for their sensitive palates and elaborate dining rituals. The Lithosians are potential trading partners of significant value, Zorax explained during the planning meeting. "Their approval of our hospitality will be essential to securing favorable terms." Linus, now comfortable enough to offer his own suggestions, proposed a variation on the traditional greeting dish served to new trading partners. "What if we incorporated elements of Lithosian cuisine into the thermal progression?" he suggested. "According to the database, they favor high-frequency resonance in their food, something we could achieve by modifying the crystalline structure of the second-phase components." Zorax considered this, his massive head tilted slightly. "An interesting proposition. It would demonstrate cultural awareness without compromising Draconis traditions. A risky deviation from protocol," Kra warned. "But potentially rewarding," Vexra countered. "The Lithosians value innovation as well as tradition." In the end, Linus's suggestion was approved, and he spent the next 3 days perfecting the modified dish. The result was a triumph. The Lithosian representatives were so impressed by the culturally informed adaptation that they immediately approved preliminary trading rights, something that typically took weeks of negotiation. Following this success, Linus's role aboard the Mercantile Claw expanded beyond mere food preparation. He became, in effect, a culinary diplomat, researching the gustatory preferences of potential trading partners and designing meals that would communicate respect while subtly emphasizing Draconis cultural values. "You have become a valuable asset," Zorax told him after a particularly successful negotiation with Centaurian merchants, the same species that had complained about Linus's excessive flavor profiles at Callaway's. "Your understanding of cross-species sensory preferences provides an advantage in complex negotiations." Linus, who had once been laughed at for suggesting that Centaurians might enjoy more flavorful food, felt a satisfaction that went beyond professional pride. He had found his place in the galaxy, and it was far more significant than he could have imagined while scrubbing grease traps at an outpost diner. But the greatest challenge and the most dangerous moment of his new career still lay ahead. The day Linus nearly poisoned a conference of the 12 most powerful species in the galaxy began, like most catastrophes, with excessive optimism. Standing in the gleaming galley of the Mercantile Claw, surrounded by cooking implements that resembled medieval torture devices more than kitchen utensils, he took a deep breath of superheated air and smiled. The massive ventilation hood above him whooshed loudly, drawing away plumes of oddly colored steam from a series of bubbling cauldrons. Each contained a different protein base for tonight's main course, Breath of the Fire Mountain, a Draconis delicacy so complex it required specialized respiratory equipment for non-Draconis chefs. "Temperature check on primary fusion reactor," Linus called to his assistant, a lanky Previan whose feathered arms were currently elbow-deep in a mixture that resembled molten gold. "Holding at 14,000 kelvins, chef." The Previan, named Tick, replied cheerfully. "The psionic compounds are stabilizing nicely." Linus nodded, adjusting the temperature dial on his forearm-mounted control panel. The specialized chef's jacket he wore had been custom-designed for cooking Draconis cuisine, with built-in cooling systems, thermal dampeners, and emergency countermeasures in case any of the more volatile ingredients decided to achieve sentience, which happened more often than the official Draconis cookbooks admitted. Tonight's dinner was not merely another trading negotiation. The Galactic Trade Federation, an alliance of the 12 most economically powerful species in known space, was considering granting the Draconis Shipping Consortium exclusive rights to the lucrative Corward passage routes. Such an agreement would triple the consortium's already substantial revenues and elevate the Draconis to a level of influence they had been seeking for generations. And somehow, Linus Okafor, former kitchen assistant at a forgettable outpost diner, was responsible for creating the sacred feast that would help secure this historic agreement. "Chef, the Galactic Trade Federation delegates are beginning to arrive," announced Zorax, ducking slightly to enter the kitchen. "The first secretary of the Lithosian Harmony has specifically requested your presence at the introduction ceremony." Linus wiped his hands on his apron. "All 7 ritual courses are prepped and synchronized. We're just waiting on the final stabilization of the Fire Mountain." "Excellent," Zorax replied. "Remember, this dinner is not merely about sustenance. The Galactic Trade Federation is considering exclusive shipping rights through Draconis territories. And the way to a dragon's heart is through their 4 stomachs." Linus finished with a grin. The introduction ceremony went smoothly. Linus, now accustomed to the formal protocols of interstellar diplomacy, performed the ritual of gustatory transparency, essentially a public declaration that no harmful substances had been incorporated into the meal, with practiced ease. The delegates, representing species as diverse as the crystalline Pyrithians and the gaseous Voxarians, seemed impressed by the human chef's cultural fluency. As the first of the 7 ritual courses was served, Linus returned to the kitchen to oversee final preparations for the centerpiece of the sacred feast, the Breath of the Fire Mountain. This dish, representing the most challenging of the ancestral migrations in Draconis history, was traditionally the most impressive sensory experience of the meal, combining extreme thermal transitions with complex flavor harmonies and theatrical presentation elements. Linus's version included an innovation he was particularly proud of, a modified protein structure that would create a cascading steam effect when the dish was presented, visually representing the volcanic eruption that had forced the ancient Draconis to adapt their physiological thermal regulation capabilities. As he carefully monitored the final preparation stages, a small insectoid being entered the kitchen, a representative of the Hijgamoni, one of the 12 Federation species. According to the diplomatic briefing, the Hijgamoni were known for their interest in culinary practices across species. "Fascinating process," the Hijgamoni representative chittered, compound eyes reflecting the kitchen's ambient light. "May I observe more closely? Our species has great respect for thermal manipulation culinary techniques. Linus, flattered by the interest and mindful of the diplomatic importance of accommodating Federation delegates, nodded. Of course, just please maintain a safe distance from the primary fusion reactor. The temperatures there would be problematic for most species. The hegemony moved about the kitchen, asking occasional questions about ingredients and techniques. Linus, focused on the precise timing required for the Fire Mountain presentation, answered distractedly while continuing his work. What he failed to notice was the moment when the hegemony paused near a storage unit containing specialized fermentation cultures, an essential component of the second thermal phase of the Fire Mountain dish. A subtle movement, a small vial produced and then concealed again, might have been visible had Linus not been concentrating on adjusting the thermal gradient of the primary protein structure. When the time came to present the breath of the Fire Mountain, Linus was confident that he had created his masterpiece. The massive serving vessel, carried by 6 kitchen assistants, was positioned at the center of the diplomatic dining chamber. With a carefully choreographed gesture, Linus activated the thermal catalyst that would begin the dish's sensory progression. The effect was initially as spectacular as he had planned. A cascade of luminescent steam erupted from the central protein structure, forming patterns in the air that mirrored the sacred geometric forms of ancient Draconis art. The delegates gasped appreciatively as the steam shifted through colors representing the thermal spectrum of the Draconis homeworld. The Draconis representatives, led by Zorax, began the traditional consumption ritual, using specialized utensils to select elements from different regions of the dish in a specific sequence. The Lithosian delegates joined in, their characteristic harmonic humming indicating pleasure at the sensory experience. Then, something went wrong. It began with a subtle shift in the color of the steam still rising from the dish, from the expected azure blue to a sickly greenish hue. Zorax noticed first, his scales flaring in alarm just as the ship's environmental systems emitted a shrill warning tone. "Atmospheric contamination detected," announced the ship's AI. "Unknown compound detected in primary ventilation system. Emergency protocols activated." Chaos erupted in the diplomatic chamber. Delegates from species with sensitive respiratory systems began showing signs of distress. The Pyrithians, in particular, were exhibiting alarming color changes in their crystalline structures. Linus stared in horror at the dish he had so carefully prepared, now clearly the source of the contamination. Somewhere in the complex chain of preparation, something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Seal the chamber," Zorax commanded, his voice cutting through the growing panic. "Activate isolation protocols." Environmental barriers slid into place, containing the affected area while emergency medical teams rushed to assist the distressed delegates. Linus stood frozen, unable to process how his creation had transformed from diplomatic triumph to potential interstellar incident. Vexra approached him, her movements urgent. "What happened? Did you modify the fermentation cultures?" "No." Linus shook his head, still stunned. "Everything followed the approved preparation protocols. I don't understand how." An alert from his chef's jacket interrupted him. The environmental sensors built into the garment had been analyzing the contamination even as the ship's larger systems responded to the emergency. "Trace elements detected," the jacket's AI reported. "Compound identified, hegemony royal enzymatic secretion, modified to produce gaseous transformation when exposed to thermal catalysts." "Hegemony," Linus repeated, suddenly remembering the insectoid visitor to his kitchen. "They sabotaged the dish." "But why?" Vexra demanded. The answer came from an unexpected source. Kra, who had been conferring with the ship's security team, approached with uncharacteristic urgency. "The target wasn't the delegates," he informed them, his voice low. "It was Okafor." "Me?" Linus blinked. "Why would anyone want to?" "The hegemony representative has been detained," Kra continued. Initial interrogation suggests this was an assassination attempt disguised as a diplomatic incident. But I'm just a chef, Linus protested. Why would anyone want to assassinate me? Zorax, who had joined them after ensuring the delegates were receiving proper medical attention, provided the answer. Because you have become more than a chef. Your culinary diplomacy has accelerated our negotiations with multiple species, bringing the consortium closer to securing the core ward passage rights. The hegemony currently controls significant portions of those shipping lanes, Vexra added. They stand to lose considerable revenue if the exclusive rights are granted to the consortium. So they tried to kill me to slow down your negotiations? Linus asked, still struggling to grasp the situation, and to create a diplomatic incident that would damage our standing with the Federation. Kra confirmed. Had delegates been seriously harmed by a dish prepared in a Draconis facility, our credibility would have been severely compromised. The implications were staggering. Linus had somehow become important enough to galactic politics that a major species was willing to assassinate him to protect their economic interests. The attempt has failed, Zorax stated firmly. The contamination was detected before any permanent harm occurred, and the hegemony representative has been exposed. If anything, this incident will strengthen our position with the Federation, as it demonstrates the lengths to which our competitors will go to prevent fair negotiation. In the days that followed, Linus's status aboard the Mercantile Claw underwent a subtle but significant transformation. No longer viewed simply as a talented chef with an intuitive understanding of cross-species cuisine, he was now recognized as a strategic asset, someone whose culinary diplomacy had become important enough to provoke assassination attempts from rival powers. The sacred feast was rescheduled, this time with enhanced security measures and without hegemony participation. When finally presented, Linus's Breath of the Fire mountain performed exactly as intended, creating a spectacular sensory experience that the Federation delegates would later describe as a defining moment in interspecies culinary history. The Galactic Trade Federation granted the Draconis Shipping Consortium exclusive rights to the core ward passage, with a contract ceremony that included a special commendation for the human chef whose innovative approach to traditional Draconis cuisine has established new standards for diplomatic gastronomy. In a private ceremony aboard the Mercantile Claw, Zorax presented Linus with a formal designation that had never before been granted to a non-Draconis. Culinary strategist and diplomatic liaison to the Consortium Inner Council. This position acknowledges that your value to the Consortium extends beyond food preparation, Zorax explained. You have demonstrated an ability to translate cultural understanding into diplomatic advantage, a rare skill that we wish to develop further. Linus, still somewhat overwhelmed by his unexpected importance in galactic politics, accepted the designation with a mixture of pride and trepidation. I'm honored, he said sincerely. Though I have to admit, when I volunteered to cook for dragons 6 months ago, I didn't expect to end up as a target for assassination or a member of your inner council. Vexra's scales rippled in amusement. Life seldom follows expected patterns, a truth that applies to both cuisine and careers. There is wisdom in that observation, Zorax agreed. And it leads to an important question. Now that you have achieved this position, what do you envision for your future with the consortium? Linus considered this carefully. He thought about his journey from dropout kitchen assistant to galactic culinary diplomat, about the laughter that had followed him when he volunteered for an impossible challenge, and about the unexpected path that had led him to this moment. I want to establish a formal culinary exchange program, he finally answered. Bring chefs from different species together to study each other's traditions, create new fusion techniques, and use food as a diplomatic bridge between cultures. Zorax nodded approvingly. An ambitious vision, and one that aligns with the consortium's expanding influence. It would also provide cover for more sensitive diplomatic operations, Kra noted pragmatically. Culinary exchange is an excellent pretext for gathering information. Linus smiled, now accustomed to Kra's perpetual focus on strategic advantage. I was thinking more about promoting cultural understanding, but sure, that too. As the meeting concluded and Linus made his way back to his quarters, now a spacious suite befitting his new status, he passed the kitchen where his journey had begun. Pausing in the doorway, he reflected on how completely his life had changed because he had dared to volunteer when everyone else laughed. From scrubbing grease traps at Callaway's to designing meals that shaped interstellar politics. From being mocked for excessive flavor profiles to surviving an assassination attempt because his culinary diplomacy had become too effective, it was a journey no one could have predicted, least of all himself. Tomorrow, he would begin designing the curriculum for the Interspecies Culinary Academy. Tonight, he would celebrate with a meal of his own creation, something that honored both his human heritage and the draconis traditions he had come to respect. As he entered the kitchen, the specialized chef's jacket he now wore with such confidence automatically adjusted its environmental settings. Linus smiled, reached for ingredients that would have terrified him 6 months ago, and began to cook, not just a meal, but a future where understanding between species began with sharing food across the stars. They had laughed when the human cook volunteered to feed the dragons. Now he was their favorite chef, their culinary diplomat, and possibly, though this part still amazed him daily, a minor but significant figure in galactic politics. And to think it had all started with a simple human desire to prove the doubters wrong.